Hello, hello, hello. My name is Joe Lazauskas. I am the head of content and comms at A.Team, and so excited to dive into the findings on our 2022 Tech Work Report with all of you. I'm going to be joined today by Cait Brumme, CEO of MassChallenge, to discuss all of our biggest findings that came to light in our survey of 581 tech founders and execs. This is a report that has generated a ton of buzz over the last few days since we released it. We saw it kind of blow up on Reddit yesterday with a ton of conversation, debate about the future of work. And we just can't wait to dive into all of this here with you. And Cait, I believe, is joining the feed now. Cait, great to have you with us here today.
Thanks, Joe. Really excited to have done this report with you and psyched for the conversation today. As you noted, we've learned a lot and we've seen some awesome reactions since it got released.
Yes, we've seen it written about in Forbes, in Fast Company, in Tech Republic, a number of other publications. So that's been great to see the interest that we've had. But we're going to go even deeper than we did in the report here today and bring in a lot of Cait's learnings, because Cait, I think you talk to founders perhaps more than anyone else than I know. So can't wait to get your insights on everything that we found. To kind of give a little bit of background, why we did this report in the first place. What were our objectives? What were our goals here? Well, there's been so much conversation around a lot of the big challenges facing tech founders and execs right now. We have the Great Resignation going on. We've had some of the biggest shifts in workplace models over the last couple of years that we're all still adapting to. And on top of that, we've seen a tech downturn and a really change in the fundraising landscape that's created a lot of uncertainty out there. And, I go to a lot of tech events here in New York, constantly here. We just have to wait and see. Well, we didn't want to wait and see. We wanted to bring some insights to light for all of you. So our big objectives, we wanted to understand those Great Resignation challenges that tech leaders are facing. We wanted to analyze those shifts in workplace models. And we wanted to do a pulse check on those downturn strategies and concerns. A little bit about our methodology. Quickly, you can dive into this more in the report. You can find that at a.team/mission. I believe that's going to pop up in a little lower third in a second. But we surveyed 581 tech founders and execs through MassChallenge's network. Respondents ranged from pre-seed to IPO stages. So you'll see some findings that focus on the whole sample set in here, and some that we're going to call out that focus on more mature companies from Series B onward, because we had a pretty even split there in terms of the respondents. And the survey was pretty recent. It ran in July, from July 11th to July 21st. So let's get into some of the big findings, Cait, and we're going to start with hiring challenges. One of the first big topics that we wanted to look at related to the Great Resignation. And what we found in our report is that the Great Resignation has taken a real toll on tech companies, where we're seeing an exodus of a lot of top performers. In our survey, 44% of tech founders and execs said that a significant number of top performers have exited due to the Great Resignation. When we looked at that Series B and above subset, that rose all the way to 53%. And when you think about top performers leaving, not just employees overall, that really stood out to me, if perhaps not being that surprising. And this kind of maps with what we're seeing in general, right? Where according to the last labor market report, 4.3 million workers quit in August. We're actually seeing that number go back up a little bit from where it was in June and July, but it's been pretty steady at like 4.1 million to 4.4 million for the last 17 months now. So it's really not slowing down. And a recent McKinsey report, their global great attrition survey, found that 40% of workers in the US still plan to quit in the next 6 months. So Cait, you talk to tech leaders so much every day. You have your own experience as a CEO. What do you make of this? Does this reflect some of what you're seeing out there?
I think, unfortunately, it does. We remain in a period of continued dislocation and uncertainty and worker mobility. I think that in the news last fall was the peak of the Great Resignation, but what this data shows and the other reports you highlighted is that this trend has continued. When we take it down to what does this mean for the founders that we work with and out in the world, I think a couple of things. One is it remains an extremely competitive labor market, and so that is an additional challenge. And I think we'll cover in the report what founders are doing to experiment and adapt. And then the second is there's increased pressure and urgency around building employee experiences and value propositions that make your company stickier. And I think that has come down to the earlier stages, earlier companies sooner, given the huge pressure that companies are seeing around turnover.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the conversation of late, there's been a lot of reporting on some of the big layoffs at tech companies, although we still see that those layoff levels are significantly below where they were in 2020. And there's been a lot of reporting that essentially a lot of those laid off workers are getting snatched up pretty immediately, which speaks to the tight talent market that you were talking about a second ago. And that was reflected in this next finding our report, where, there's been a lot of talk of hiring freezes, layoffs, and yet 45% of the tech founders and execs that we surveyed said that their hiring plans have actually increased over the past 6 months. I think you can see a real correlation there between the continued pain of the Great Resignation and the fact that, okay, we need to replace those top performers inside of our orgs, right? But when we isolated the sample set of Series B to IPO companies, that figure jumped all the way to 59%, saying that their hiring plans had increased. I'm curious what you make of this delta between earlier stage companies, right? And where we see nearly 60% of Series B and above companies increasing their hiring plans. Any insight there?
Yeah, I think this is a hint of optimism. The headlines tend to lead with the dire, but if we think of the best of times and the worst of times, right, this data to me indicates when you look at the subsegment of later stage companies that those companies are still growing and they plan to grow and they have indications that they're growing and they're able to and willing to put hiring plans around that. So I think that is a great sign, and certainly something that we see with our alumni coming back, looking for support in accessing the best talent in what is a competitive environment. And I think at the early stage, what this indicates is that they're moderating their hiring plans, on a relative basis to the more mature companies until they find their footing. And I think that correlates a little bit to what we'll see later in the report around less confidence that the funding environment will sweep them up with less signals, and so they're matching hiring plans to either revenue traction or funding, perhaps more cautiously than a year ago when we were in a place of euphoria.
Yeah, and there's also that element that it is a tough fundraising environment, right? We all know that, but you still need to build, right? You still need to take that next leap that's going to allow you to show the revenue growth, the future potential that's going to get you there. And so you need to bring in the right talent inside of your org to do that. And I think that as much talk, and we'll get into this a little bit later in that section of the report, but while there's a lot of this, talk around reduce churn, get to profitability, cut back, there still is that need to really bring in the talent that's going to help you capitalize on a lot of the big changes we see in the overall work landscape right now. And one thing we know is that when we have these moments of downturn and turmoil, there's also when a lot of big opportunities pop up. So that could be why we're seeing tech leaders continuing to invest in bringing on the right talent into their work. So perhaps in some different ways that we'll talk about in a second.
That's the sort of thread of optimism we see throughout, which is, I think, especially for founders, the best defense is a good offense, right, in this case. And so, companies are leaning forward. They are hiring. They're prioritizing revenue and funding over cost cutting. in part out of necessity, in part because that's the startup spirit. That's how you get through the hard parts.
Yeah, absolutely. To quote A16Z, it's time to build. But this part was really interesting to me amidst those raised hiring plans, that there's definitely increased frustration with the traditional recruitment process. And, I was talking to one of my friends who's a founder and CEO and hiring a lot right now. And he kind of compared the traditional recruitment process to like hailing a taxi cab before Uber. It's like still feels really analog. It's one thing that hasn't taken the same leap in digital evolution and advancement. I think as a lot of other parts of our jobs today. And I'm curious if that like resonates from you. Do you feel this frustration with the founders that you talk to over the kind of long, often frustrating slog of full-time hiring that can take quite a while to do?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. Not only is it a competitive environment, but the practices, the tools, the partners out there, by and large, are not built for startups. Startups by nature typically need solutions that are more agile, lower cost, higher velocity, more flexible. And the traditional recruiting practices, hiring a recruiter, sending them a resume, working back and forth, like that's not built for a startup who needs to bring on, 10 people in a month, for example. And so it's not at all surprising to me to see these statistics, well over 50% dissatisfaction with current processes, and a perspective that it's broken, it needs an overhaul. And, shout out to what you all are building, real openness and excitement about the types of solutions that are coming into this void to disrupt this market.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's one thing that we're seeing at A-Team a lot, right? Is that you have companies that need to build fast. Like if you're a startup, right, you need to get that right team to develop your first product and bring it to market quickly. And so we see with A-Team, for those that don't know, A-Team, we're a team formation platform that brings together teams of highly skilled XFang builders to solve crucial missions and initiatives for companies of all types, particularly for tech companies. And at the startup stage, we see a lot of people just not wanting to wait 4 to 6 months to hire their founding product and engineering team and wanting to spin up and get to work with an A-Team, but also growth stage companies, enterprise companies who want to develop new products. It also becomes a much faster way to do that. So I think that, for us personally, like this frustration is probably a tailwind in some ways, but I think it also just calls out a lot of the ways that we need to rethink our talent model moving forward. And also note on this, for everyone in the audience, we want to hear from you. So we're going to have some time for questions at the end of this, also comments. Want to hear your reactions to this. So yes, as you see right there, please drop your comments in the chat and we'll feature a few on screen throughout the presentation, particularly at the Q&A in the end. All right. And not sort of on that note, next up, we also saw that 62% said that it takes 4 months or more to fill product and engineering roles on average, which perhaps isn't surprising, but I think highlights some of this frustration with the recruitment process. We also saw product and engineering as the hardest roles to fill, but really like spread out across the board. I think that speaks to some of the impact of the Great Resignation here. And that I think is just all part of the picture, right? This talent is really in demand, hard to hire, and taking that long period of time can just feel quite frustrating. This is one that really stood out to me. So in April, we heard Elon Musk come out, made headlines, said that Tesla wouldn't require a college degree to work there. And it seems like that's picked up amongst the tech founders and execs that we survey, with over 80% say they're willing to hire someone without a college degree for any role. Perhaps it made me regret the $200,000 that I spent going to Sarah Lawrence College once upon a time. But Cait, what did you make of this?
Yeah, we think this is a great development on a couple of different fronts. I mean, one, we know the huge opportunity for the tech ecosystem and the startup ecosystem in particular to embrace and benefit from a much more diverse set of employees. And so the idea of breaking down some of those traditional barriers to participation and hiring based on potential or skills as opposed to classic resume marks, we think is a real boon for the opportunity for the startup ecosystem to be more diverse and inclusive on a bunch of different dimensions. I think secondly, we've seen companies building into this, experimenting, as I mentioned, with skill-based hiring as opposed to resume-based hiring. And so knowing that customers are willing to try and find talent in new and novel ways and bring them into their companies is a huge benefit. And I think throughout, like we'll just highlight that I think this is going to raise questions then about pulling forward, people practices like skill building, training, et cetera, to make sure that those individuals who come in perhaps with less traditional backgrounds have the chance to be successful and have the right support systems around them.
Yeah, I think that's really important to call out. And that is something that we saw here, where 41% of tech leaders said they're actually increasing over the next 12 months their investment in tech upskilling programs. That went all the way up to 50% amongst those Series B and above companies. So we do see that as a really important investment that people are making in turn, which is really great to see. I think this is also going to be something that's becomes more and more important for career development and advancement issues that really matter to workers. So in McKinsey's great attrition survey that we mentioned, a lack of career development and advancement was actually the number one reason that people are leaving their jobs right now. So we see that this is crucial, not just for upskilling your talent, not just for attracting your talent, but also for keeping your talent and maybe combating some of those forces that we see in the Great Resignation.
Yeah, I think this is a really potent addition to the startup value proposition, if you would. I mean, startups benefit from having awesome missions and clear purpose from the get-go, agile entrepreneurial environments, and typically fast growth. So there are pathways for promotion and advancement. If you marry in then intentional skill development and career advancement on top of that to allow employees to grow alongside the organization, I think that starts to really combat some of the benefits that larger companies are able to offer, perhaps around salary or stability or clear promotion pathways. So this is, I think, a real benefit to early stage companies leaning into this culture, people work earlier on.
Yeah, I think the other element that we're going to have to deal with here that's come up more and more in future of work discussions is how do you also, when we're going more and more remote, right, create that sense of learning and development when we're not all in the office for early career employees. When you don't have that one-on-one mentorship, how do we foster that virtually? I think that would be one that would be really interesting for us to explore in the future together, right? Because it's one of the biggest questions that comes up as I talk to folks in the market. But yeah, this is good to see overall.
Yeah, Joe, I think that's a really interesting point. And as you mentioned, comes up in a number of dimensions, which is namely, how do companies have to really rethink how they manage and engage their people, not only through upskilling, but to make it a stickier workplace and do this training that's historically been done through apprenticeship, sitting side by side in the office. That no longer works the same way. So a lot more intention. And I think probably that's reflected in these numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, the next section that we really wanted to look at was this new idea of a blended workforce that came out in our research. And a big motivation here was that we've seen this independent work movement over the last couple of years really rise up. Where 53% of all freelancers today offer in-demand skills like programming and IT. So we've seen this movement of a lot more of the freelance workforce being highly skilled tech workers than before. 36% of all US workers now freelance, according to Upwork's recent research. And over the last 2 years, something that Bloomberg analyzed was that 33% of the growth in the labor force since 2020 has come from self-employed. So even when there's a lot of jobs out there for people to get, right, more and more people are choosing this life of more autonomy, flexibility, working on the things that matter to them. We actually have a piece coming out on Mission today, which you'll find when you go to look for the report on our Future of Work publication. But McKinsey identified this new persona of the do-it-yourselfer, which is this big trend of people in the prime of their careers that are ditching traditional work for jobs with more gigs with more autonomy, multiple different fractional positions at a number of different companies. We had a separate study as well where we asked highly skilled independent workers what sort of drove them to independent work over full-time. 74% said job satisfaction, 70% said financial opportunities, and 68% said work-life balance. So we sort of see some of the things that are driving people to independent work. But we wanted to understand, okay, then how are tech founders and execs adapting to this new workforce? How are they thinking about utilizing them? So we wanted to dive into that a little bit. First thing that we asked was, do you have integrated blended teams of freelancers and full-time employees? So traditionally, freelancers have been treated like as very siloed, task-based, go do this data entry project, write this one article, do this bit of graphic design, whatever it might be. But now we're seeing that 73% actually have integrated blended teams inside their orgs of freelancers and full-time employees, a new way of thinking about the way that you form teams. Another 11% said that they don't have it now, but they have planned to soon. So it's really like the vast majority here of those that we interviewed, that we surveyed. And freelancers make up more than a quarter of the workforce at nearly half of companies as well. So wondering if you see this in your own experience at MassChallenge with all of the companies that you work with. Do you see this trend of, having more of these integrated blended teams of freelancers and FTEs?
Joe, I think this data is awesome. I mean, as we know, startups have always been excellent users of freelancers as they manage their costs early on. But I think, what really stands out here, as you emphasize, is one, the focus on blended teams. And so this is an intentional use and integration of full-time and freelance or contract workers, into one team. And second, the size of the team that this now comprises. I think there's one, school of thought that says maybe this is just an overhang from COVID or a reflection of the macro environment where we know founders are using flexible workforce to manage cost. But I think the data that we're seeing, and I would say even in my own experience as CEO, is that there's something really sticky here. And it's both around what employees want, purpose, flexibility, customization, and what companies need. And so I think certainly what we're seeing is that this trend will continue. I think that startups may very well be on the frontier of really experimenting with and defining what these blended teams look like and how that intersects with both the virtual hybrid debate and also sort of rethinking culture and team management. So this is super interesting, resonates really with our team. As I mentioned, we have 5 former employees who are now currently with other partners, but still do freelance work for us because they love our mission. They do it nights and weekends, evenings, and it's a way to stay engaged with what they really care about.
Yeah, and I think that, this is obviously something that we see a lot at A.Team, where more and more, some of our customers now, since, bringing on A-teams, have product and engineering departments that are like 50-50 splits between the folks who are contract and folks that are full-time. Even at our own company, at A-Team, like half are A-teamers from the network in our build team and half are full-time employees. Honestly, we don't really distinguish between the two at all. They come to our global summits. They're at our all hands. They get the board readouts. And I have a suspicion that is what we're going to see more and more in the future, is that sort of more folks will choose this more independent lifestyle, right? Of wanting to work on the missions, the initiatives that matter to them, not necessarily be tethered to this one job, one role mentality. And then in turn, that creates an opportunity to develop more of these blended teams and sort of rethink what a team is inside of your company in this way. And certainly we also saw a lot of our respondents saying some of those things that you noted a second ago, right? About some of the advantages of this, especially right now. Where 71% said that economic uncertainty has made them more likely to bring on freelancers right now. 71% said that it gives their business greater agility, where you can sort of, right, your hiring plans at the beginning of the year often kind of you're thrown out the door at this point, because things have changed so much. Your product development cycle, your plans, where you see your biggest initiatives have changed. So being able to very quickly not have to forecast everyone you need to bring on, but quickly scale up and down using a lot of the platforms we have available to us today based on what your needs are, not have as much waste, right? Bring in the right outside talent into your org can give you a lot greater agility. And then we can't ignore remote work as a factor here, right? When increasingly we don't work in offices, we work in the cloud. The cloud is like the HQ of a lot of our companies right now, even if we might have physical spaces. You know, I can be at the office working with my team, and half the time we're sitting across from each other in a room together, but we're really working in the cloud. We've made this shift to more remote-based, cloud-based companies, right? That makes it a lot easier to bring on folks who aren't necessarily FTEs.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I haven't heard of the cloud as HQ. I love that. But yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one other thing that's important to highlight here is the good news is more employees want freedom and flexibility. And the other good news is that companies see that as valuable to them. And so that's a really happy marriage between two trends today. And I think as always, when we're thinking about flexible workforces, we'll keep an eye on ensuring that there's the right protections in place for workers. But to date, again, it seems a really happy marriage. And absolutely, the embracing of virtual teams or hybrid workforces, I think, is a real enabling factor here, and also allows people to access talent far beyond their typical markets. MassChallenge has been a huge beneficiary of that. We now have teams in New York, Atlanta. We have several engineers over in Africa, and we're headquartered in Boston.
Yeah, that's quite the spread, but that's more and more the norm, right? I think we're at like a little over 100 people at A.Team now. And I think we're in over 20 countries, and it also brings a lot of diversity of thought and perspective when you have that. I found you get such different viewpoints on working on different ideas that I don't think I would have appreciated before, but I really do now. You know, even if you have demographic diversity, if you all are coming from living in Brooklyn, like in basically like 4 neighborhoods, which is tech companies I've been at before, like maybe you don't have as much cognitive diversity and different viewpoints on the world and kind of where things are headed.
Well said.
So here we start to get into what I think is a very interesting contradiction that's generated a ton of buzz over the past few days in our report, which is that 62% said that shifting to a more flexible work model during the pandemic has increased employee productivity. So this has been a positive thing. And yet it looks like a return to the office may loom. 37% of our response overall said they plan to ask employees to work more from the office over the next 12 months. But the one I want to focus on is those Series B, C, D, E IPO companies, where that number jumped to 55%. I wrote about this in Fast Company earlier this week. It got shared on Reddit. It kind of went off with almost 1,000 comments and a ton of likes, or a ton of upvotes. People didn't necessarily love the news, but there's a lot of debate and outcry at this. We see that a Gallup survey last week showed that 94% of workers said that they want to stay remote or hybrid, and yet tech companies look like they do want to return to the office more. And you look at someone like Apple, right? So Apple is mandating a 3-day-a-week return to the office. The big reason behind it is they think that they're, lacking the kind of creativity and spontaneous collaboration that you get when you're in the office. Classically, why jobs put the bathrooms in the middle of the office, right, is to foster that.
Yeah.
But it's something that workers really don't want. Even at Apple, where over 1,000 people have signed a petition protesting this. So I'm curious, with the companies that you speak with, how you think of this as a CEO again. Like, what do you make of this contradiction here?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a stark example, including the Reddit reaction to the conundrum. So this data suggests that CEOs or executives are saying we need you back in the office, and employees are saying no way in hell am I going back to a normal commute, et cetera. And I think it's a couplefold. One is the prior slide highlights the productivity increased. But there's still this big open question, as you mentioned, around culture and creativity. And I think in the startup world, there's also a question around like velocity. Do you need that creativity and culture to support the velocity that you're looking for? And that has yet to be solved confidently solved in our new environment. And so I think CEOs and executives, particularly those who are super experienced or guided by those who are really experienced, are saying, okay, well, let's at least do what we knew worked before, which is come back to the office so we can be together. And that's creating this real push-pull with what employees want. And so, we certainly see it in our own team, but also with the startups we're working with. And I'll give you some really simple stats. As we have about 150 startups in residency in our headquarter office. And on any given day, probably 30% of the people are in the office. They want the choice, but they also want the flexibility. And that's markedly different from before COVID, where we had founders working side by side with their teams, using our offices as a procurement or fulfillment center on a daily basis. So this, I think, is a big open question. And just as with the large companies, I think founders have to be intentional, be delicate, listen to their employees, and bring a lot of intention to the why they want people together, as opposed to starting with, well, let's get together.
I think that intentionality, I love that word. That's so key, because nothing is more frustrating than spending an hour, 2 hours commuting into an office and then just sitting on Zoom calls all day. Like I don't know if there's a more frustrating feeling in the world in the modern workplace, or you have a few people in the office on Zoom, everyone else or together, everyone else on Zoom. You spend like the first 10 minutes of the meeting trying to get, it up on that TV in the corner of the room. The sound is terrible from one of those little pod things in the middle of the table. And it's even a worse experience.
Yes.
So I think intentionality is the big key word there. If we're going to make this work, like bring people together with a purpose where you're actually getting something greater out of working together. One thing that I love that we did at A-Team was that in May, we brought our global team together, both the blended teams, our full-time employees, the A-teamers on the build team, together for a summit in Portugal. We realized that Portugal was the kind of middle ground for flying everyone in. Really cheap to fly into, and pretty cheap to have be able to stay at a pretty awesome 5-star golf resort near the coast together, and then had a very purposeful different task force that we were collaborating on together. But one of the knock-on effects that I didn't anticipate was that bonding that happened there, where I could work with some of my colleagues that maybe I didn't get a little tinge of their dry sense of humor over Zoom, but you immediately get it in person when you start to interact and hang out with them more. That's carried over in much closer relationships for the 4+ months since. So it's having that intentionality around how and why you bring people together while still giving them the ability to work the way that they really want to work. And I think if you do that, right, that's something that people won't object to. I think what people are reacting to so much is I read through those nearly 1,000 comments on the Reddit thread about this study, was that that's at the core of the frustration, is being forced back to work for no real apparent reason.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think we really need to solve.
Yeah, Joe, I think what you also highlight with your example is that the idea of return to office for collaboration suggests that everyone is in that office. But if we look at what's happened over the course of the last 2 years with distributed teams, that's just not the case. And so that's exactly your point, is that bringing people back to the office means they're in the office on Zoom with their, other 50% of their colleagues who are around the world. So this, you brought up one good example. We have an alumni flywire in Boston who's does these like flycations with bringing people off site to work together periodically. And it's all around dosage. What's the right dosage that's required to build relationships, culture, solve problems, and then let people get back to benefiting from what we know is the sort of excellent experiment of virtual hybrid work.
Yeah, I think that's a great example right there. All right, let's get into the last section of our key findings. Then we'll get to some of the great questions that have been coming in. We want to look at downturn strategies and concerns. So how are folks approaching this very important moment in time, a little difficult moment in time? So I felt like this whole conversation really got kicked off back in May when Sequoia posted their big memo, 52-page memo about a crucible moment in tech. Sounded kind of terrifying, like I'm gonna melt in the fires of my own burn rate, right? And really warning founders not to plan to fundraise for another 24 months, and to really, pull back, cut back, like try and get your burn rate down, try and get to profitability. So we wanted to find out what were these leaders' plans when it comes to fundraising. And 78% said that despite those warnings, they do plan to fundraise in the next 18 months. 60% plan to fundraise in the next 12 months. So from January onwards. So that's sort of the 18 months time span is basically taking us to the end of 2023, 12 months to midpoint of next year. I wish we had done this report together a year ago so we could have something to benchmark against. But I'm curious how you think this compares to what we would have seen, even 6 months ago, while the fundraising market was still fairly frothy.
Yeah. So this is, I went back as a, rough benchmark and looked at our incoming startup data. And we work with early stage companies. So that's only a segment here. And what we saw was, variation of this, but namely over the next 18 months, virtually 75% of companies plan to fundraise. And I think that's at least at the early stage, like by necessity. Many need funding to support operations because they're pre-revenue or not generating sufficient revenue to grow. And so despite the macro environment, there is still pressure on companies to prepare for and be successful in fundraising. There's also a possibility, and we've been working really hard to make sure this is not the case with our founders, but folks are not getting the memo about the macro environment and some of the disruption that's happening. And so, while we want founders to continue to pursue funding, prepared, optimistic, ready to go, I think it's also important to still be aware of what environment they're fundraising into. Remains slightly healthier, I think, in the pre-seed seed range, and certainly slightly later stage, we've seen slowing and or preference for follow-ons as opposed to new rounds. And that's really real.
I'm perhaps maybe jealous of some of those founders that have avoided this news. They must have a much healthier Twitter habit than I do. If you've managed to avoid that news over the last 4 months, I guess good for you. You've really been heads down on your product and what you're building, and maybe zoning some of that other stuff out. But yes, it's important to kind of find this middle ground. I think there is perhaps some posturing on the VC side to try and drive down expectations, more than it might be. But I think your points are right. And we see this reflected when we asked about top priorities, right, of these founders, where despite those, warnings to focus on reducing burn, revenue growth and fundraising do remain really top priorities. 43% named revenue growth their top priority, 22%. Fundraising, does this really like match up those conversations that you've been having where it's like, okay, if I want to get to the next round, I need to build that next product. I mean, I need to get my sales team and go-to-market team up to speed where we're going to show that momentum that's going to overcome this. And I still do need to focus on getting to that next round.
Yeah, I know, Joe, when we were reflecting on this data together, it's a both and from what we say. So anecdotally at the interperson, when we're checking in with our founders, we're hearing thoughtfulness and caution around big spend. In particular, I think that maps well to the earlier conversation we had around use of freelancers or contract workers as opposed to full-time hires, delaying decisions around space permanently to just sort of manage the burn. But at the end of the day, these founders want to grow. They want to be big. They want to be bold. They're looking to get in front of customers. They know their customers have needs, or at least they believe their customers have those needs. And so they are extremely growth oriented and, ready and willing to get out there and secure funding to back their visions.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot of us got into this particular game to play it safe, right? It's why you start a startup, is why you take a leap being, an executive at an early stage company, is because you do want to hit that home run. If you're playing it safe, you might be at JP Morgan Chase or, Adobe instead. Not that there's anything wrong with those companies, but just a different mindset of the type of career that you want.
Yep, I think that's right.
But we did see, despite this continued optimism, that there is more long-term concern about the health of their org compared to 6 months ago, or 57% said they're more concerned about the long-term health of their company than they were 6 months ago. When we were talking about this, I was not that surprised by it. But then you pointed out something that I thought was really interesting, is that when we actually think of what was happening 6 months ago, before the survey was taken, so right after the new year, is that the markets had started to go down a bit already, but then also like Omicron was raging, like inflation, supply chains were starting to become like a really, really big issue. If you look at the case chart on the New York Times, like it is spiking at that point in time. So there were reasons to be concerned then, which perhaps makes this finding a little bit starker than you think otherwise.
Yeah, it also makes me feel deeply empathetic for these founders who thought they were worried 6 months ago, and it turns out they're even more worried now, right? And that requires endurance to be in a place of survival mode for this sustained period of time. My hypothesis on this, and especially talking to founders, is that the sort of continued uncertainty in the macro vibes, the inflation, uncertainties around funding, the sustained turnover, Great Resignation, worker dissatisfaction effects. I think that's taxing and creates a lot of uncertainty just around what the future looks like. And we saw this, even the Business Roundtable released a report yesterday where on the one hand, CEOs are making plans to grow, et cetera, but there's still this sort of sense of doom that's creating a long-term overhang.
I'd love to dig into that report. And I think that sense of doom can be really mentally taxing, as you're saying. And that sort of leads us to our next finding here too, which is that we asked tech founders and exec about their own mental health, their employees' mental health, the burnout of their employees. And this maybe was the most surprising result that we see. It's an anonymous survey, so a lot of perhaps greater honesty around this. But 72% said they're concerned about the mental health of their employees. 63% are concerned about employee burnout. 62% concerned about their own mental health. And 59% are concerned about their own burnout. And, we almost forget sometimes, I think, that we've gone through a really taxing few years,
Yes.
in addition to all that whole cloud of uncertainty that hangs over us now. So yeah, to what you were just saying, like, do you feel this when you go and talk to a lot of the CEOs that you're working with?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think the only silver lining in these numbers is that I think mental health is something that the startup ecosystem, founders, business leaders are talking about as something that's important, real, and frankly, a business concern. And so we certainly, it's something that definitely comes up with founders that I connect with. I always check in with them on it. And many of them, even the early stage, very early stage companies that we would consider still in survival mode, are thinking hard about how do I create a more sustainable culture, not just for me, but for my employees early on. With that said, I think for those organizations out there that are working with and supporting founders and their teams, take this data to heart and spend time understanding the emotional state of your teams and how you as an advisor or a venture funder can play a role in providing some relief or support.
Yeah, and we are seeing a lot more mental health options out there. I was at HR Transform, this conference a few months ago, and one thing that stood out to me is just how many different mental health options that there are, new opportunities. I think also creating greater freedom and like a sense of security in using those options for employees is really crucial. We have a great piece on this our deputy editor Benji wrote on Mission that maybe we can share in the follow-up to this webinar. But I agree that's really, really important. Okay, we want to get to Q&A in a second. Please remember to drop any questions you have in the chat. I've seen a few great ones come in so far. But that was a little bit of a downer. So we want to end on a little bit of an optimistic note looking forward. Because we do know that downturns are when the most dramatic opportunities in the market emerge. And I think one thing that we are seeing in this report is a true willingness by tech leaders to rethink the way things are done, to get to that next level, to propel themselves forward. I think 2 years ago, you saw this high of a use of integrated blended teams in the workforce, this different way of thinking about adopting this great talent pool of freelancers, the willingness to hire folks without a college degree, invest in upskilling programs. That's all really positive. And so it's this sort of rapid change that marks what is the greatest thing about our industry. And I think even all the disruption we're going to see moving forward offers a huge opportunity to really become that next generation of great companies. So while there are many issues left to face, like this is what we do. We adapt, we try new things, we seize on those opportunities. And I think those that do will definitely put themselves in a position to win. Any final thoughts before we get to Q&A, Cait?
No, I'm just glad we're ending on a note of optimism, because I think that's the thread throughout is, wow, we are seeing huge, hopefully enduring change in the way we work together that has major opportunities for inclusion, for integration of talent across the globe, and a work-life balance that may be more appealing to employees. So that's a huge positive. And I think we also see founders, in some of those sub-statistics, still a line of sight on growth and a huge impact. And so that we're cheering you on. We're here to support. That perseverance is important and will make a difference, as you can see with these logos on the slide.
Yeah, opportunity to be the next Venmo, Airbnb, Slack, Asana, those little companies that emerged from the last downturn, right?
Yes.
That opportunity is in front of us. Okay, it's time for a little Q&A. I think we're going to show them on screen, but I can jump right into one of the first ones I see in the chat from Curtis, who asks, do either of you believe that professional social media like LinkedIn can shorten the recruiting and hiring process? That's an interesting one. So like I use LinkedIn Jobs for sure, but I'm not sure it really shortens that process quite as much. It just feels like another iteration on the traditional job board in a lot of ways. And a lot of times you're posting on LinkedIn Jobs for visibility, but then still trying to migrate those folks into your in-house ATS. And sometimes it can even make it feel longer, although it is a great tool for getting in front of applicants, right? And doing employer branding and recruiting folks. So I'm not so sure there that that's the solution that's going to speed up the hiring process. But Cait, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can, and it often depends on sort of personal distribution or how well you're prepared to use the LinkedIn recruiting tool. I think it can help maybe on the front end, like how long does it take you to recruit a pipeline of candidates you like? But as you say, once you get into the vetting, the screening, the interviewing, et cetera, you're still back to business as usual, which has, a long tail timeline.
Yeah, my wife is an executive search consultant, and she has talked about like she can't imagine doing that job before LinkedIn existed, because how else are you going to find people? You used to have to like call companies and pretend that you wanted to talk to the head of PR in their directory in hopes of just like landing someone who might be good for a job. But I think in terms of taking this next step away from one Web 1.0 to 3.0 solution, I'm not sure LinkedIn is going to be it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at one of our next questions. Have companies in your network discovered any best practices for remote team management? I think that's a really good one. One of the biggest questions that we get. One thing that I've noticed with A.Team, because we, have spun up, about 400 new remote teams with our customers, is that onboarding becomes a lot more important, right? So a lot of times some of the processes that you have to put in place, you might not have to put in place if you're all working together in an office until, you're 50 employees, 100 employees, you have to do much earlier on. But that investing in that clear flow, right? Here's where our code base is. Here are the tools that we use to collaborate, is really important. Another element that I think is super important is where you have your decision making sit. So what I think makes the hallmark of a cloud-based company or a remote first company, and I'm stealing this from our CEO, Raphael, he was telling this to me the other day, but I thought was really smart, is that your decision making is based in the cloud. So if you are remote, right, you don't feel that disadvantage where you're being cut out of the loop where all the big decisions are being made in the office. What would you suggest?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of things I would add. One is that learning, decision making, brainstorming, sort of like through osmosis, can no longer be assumed. Meaning, you're not sitting in the office with someone sort of working through or likely to engage with them. So we think huge intentionality around clear, proactive communication, intentionality around, as you mentioned, the onboarding and the training. Clarity around the governance, the organizational governance, like who sits where and how do decisions get made, so individuals know who and where to go to for support, are all super critical, as are investments. I mean, this is more at an administrative level, in the right tools to support a higher quality asynchronous work. That's sort of another aspect that's really important.
Yeah, one thing that working on sketching out that I find really interesting is what does an ideal like remote team management tech stack look like today? Because that's one of the hardest things to solve is like what tools should we use? And there's so many better tools than there were even 3 years ago. Like that's one of the best innovations I think that's happened since the pandemic hit. So much easier to collaborate in the cloud than it was. But those tools are a really important one to hit. All right, I think we have time for one last question. And this is on the topic of not requiring a college degree. I asked for us to please comment on the range of pre-employment options from like Google's offerings. I think that means like Google's education courses to various boot camps to on-the-job training, which I think is really interesting because it gets at like, what are you providing to employees that they can upskill on their own versus a lot of the osmosis stuff that you get from working with your peers in-house. You have any thoughts on this one, Cait?
Yeah, so I think I would segment into the disaggregation of like education, and that I put the pre-employment options into a lot of the interesting work that's happening around like blocking and stacking of credentials. So rather than having to get a 4-year computer science degree, you can go to we work with Hack Diversity in Boston. It's, a 6-week coding training camp and then an intern placement, and you end with a credential that's valid to the employer. So that's sort of one variation, really powerful on ramps when, the employers know what those credentials mean. So I think you want to ensure that the program you're joining has some sort of external validity or credibility so that there's value in your time and that credential. I think the second is when you join a company, what the on-the-job training or upskilling programs look like, informal or formal, and sort of how that gives you a ladder or not. And that's more of sort of when you're looking at a company, what are the options, benefit, values? And even better if they are providing credentials or upskilling that's, again, externally valid. So when you go to look to your next job, you're able to port those credentials or onto your resume and sort of carry them forward.
Yes, that balance of help me climb the ladder internally, help me also advance my career externally. That's the sweet spot. Yeah. All right, we are just about time. This was fantastic. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined. This will be available on replay. If you want to dig into it again, share it with any colleagues, please feel free to. We are going to be sending a copy of the slide deck afterwards, as well as the full report, which you can get on a.team/mission, our future of work publication mission. It's right at the top of the homepage. Dig into all of the findings. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. Love to talk about this stuff. And thank you so much for being here. Can't wait, Cait, until we can do this again.
Next year. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.